Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this live discussion on whether Canada needs a national childcare system. I'm Aaron Wudrick. I'm the director of the domestic policy program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's actually my first day on the job, and I am very delighted to be acting as your moderator for this discussion with a couple of leading policy experts. Joining us today, we have Dr. Jack Mintz. He's the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary and a Distinguished Senior Fellow here at the MLI. And Paige MacPherson, who's a former colleague of mine at the CTF and now based in Halifax. She's an independent policy analyst and researcher focusing on education and family policy, among other areas. So thank you both for joining us today. And we're going to talk about childcare. It's fair to say that this issue, this proposal, is the centerpiece of the federal budget that was released last week. In terms of cost, there's certainly nothing that approaches it, with perhaps the exception of spending on debt interest payments. $30 billion they've committed over 5 years, and then $8.3 billion annually thereafter. And the proposed structure is that it would go to provinces for the purpose of instituting, or in the case of Quebec, supplementing a universal daycare system with a target cost of $10 a day. So very big announcement, and wanted to just get some thoughts from you on it overall. First, the fact that this idea of a national daycare system has been bandied about for decades. I just wanted your thoughts on why you think now is the time that the federal government has decided to act on it. Jack?
Well, I think it's simply reflective right now of their priorities. Now, I will say with the pandemic, there has been a very significant shift. In fact, data that I've seen for Alberta is that there's been a very sharp reduction in the number of daycare enrollees in the program, and that's because of people losing their jobs or going on fewer hours of work or being at home and therefore not needing daycare, which can be expensive. And so there's actually a lot of spaces available relative to the number to the amount of demand at this point. That could change, and of course, one of the ways of trying to achieve recovery is, of course, encouraging people get back to work. And so childcare services is obviously one of the things you want to make sure that's in place. But that doesn't necessarily argue for a big national daycare program, but it does, I think, put a little bit of priority on the childcare issue, especially as some people argue, I don't think quite correctly, but that this was a she recession and therefore we need to help women the most. But in my view, it's really just trying to take advantage of the pandemic atmosphere right now for pushing this program.
What do you think, Paige? Just trying to use the pandemic to further their political objective?
Well, I do think that certainly the government has used the pandemic as a springboard for really big spending programs. Some ministers have characterized it as this opportunity to take advantage of. So that's no secret. But of course, when we've had lockdowns as a result of the pandemic, a lot of the childcare at home did fall onto women, and many women, myself included, decided to shift the way that they were working. I went to part-time work. I have other friends who are mothers who did the same. We've seen a lot of women do that. And so it's been a stressful time, certainly because the lockdowns have had big impacts and people haven't been able to go to work. People are concerned about the virus, or they're concerned about whatever the case may be at school. People have shifted to homeschooling. But I think that, we need to, see how this shakes out over time, because we don't know how, once we shift back to, hopefully, normal, as opposed to the new normal, we don't know how those patterns are going to play out long term in terms of women re-entering the workforce or not. And I think that we also need to be very careful in making sure that we're not just, social engineering women towards certain choices. Women are making choices sometimes out of necessity, but sometimes just out of sheer preference. And a lot of women might have started working from home. Perhaps they like being home with their children part-time or whatever it may be. Families make different choices for all different sorts of reasons. The pandemic is now one of those reasons. So any sort of childcare policy, in my mind, that is the best kind of policy is one that is flexible and puts parents in the driver's seat, the ability to make their own choices for their own families, including women, as opposed to just seeing it as, sheer numbers. Okay, women have stopped working. Many women have stopped working. Therefore, we need to do X and Y policy to get them back into the workforce. We need to make sure that policies support women in the choices that they actually want to be making. And in that respect, when it comes to childcare policy, in my view, flexibility is very key. And we just don't see that out of a universal daycare policy.
That's a great point on flexibility. And I do want to come back to that a little bit later on. I do want to talk first about jurisdiction. I mean, one of the headlines we saw the day after this was announced was you had premiers in various provinces, premiers balk at federal program. I think it speaks to, some of the jurisdictional challenges we have in our federation generally, but also, the fact that they don't mention in the federal budget that the provinces are going to have to contribute significant sums to this as well. Many people point out that the provinces are in a much more precarious fiscal position. So, Jack, I mean, what are your thoughts on whether some provinces are able to take on, the matching funding for a program of this scale and size?
Well, first of all, I agree with Paige's comment that we really need to see what's going to happen after the pandemic. And, when I say after the pandemic, hopefully this is not going to carry on for a long time with variants and everything else that's happening. But we don't know really what the patterns of work are going to be in the future. There could be some shifts that we in society that are going to make a difference. But we also know that the provinces are going to be in difficult shape in terms of their fiscal priorities. And this is just adding on another cost. It's interesting. Everyone talks about the $8.2 billion cost, which is the kind of like annual cost once the program is fully implemented, excluding another bit of money also that's going into some other aspects, and not including whatever deal is with Quebec, because Quebec doesn't qualify for this program, and they're going to get another package of some sort. And we don't have any idea what that package is going to cost yet. But if you start looking at that doesn't include the provincial expenditures. So instead of $8.2 billion, we need to double that to $16 billion. And it's a pretty large chunk of money. And it's very important for the provinces who are already struggling, I think, with very difficult budgets. There is an issue also about jurisdiction. I mean, the provinces are responsible for the regulation of daycare, but the federal government actually has its own role in providing financial support. In fact, they could have done it without a conditional grant program. If they wanted to provide tax credits for childcare, they could have done that. If they wanted to fund spaces, they could have done that. In fact, they didn't even need to do a conditional grant program and force the provinces into a cost-sharing Medicare type style program where it has to be regulated spaces, and it's kind of we know best type approach for the whole country and applying it on that basis. And in fact, I think it would have been much better, I think, for the federal government to, as they've done with the child benefit, if they wanted to support, affordability for daycare, they could have introduced the program on their own without going through years of negotiation with the provinces that is not needed at all.
Paige, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that I would add is that you've got very different demographic situations in different provinces, or at least somewhat different. When you look at New Brunswick, which has a heavily aging population, very different than Alberta, which has a much younger population. These different provincial governments might have completely different childcare policies in mind. Not to mention that voters in the provinces elect different governments with different ideas and policies that they put forward and presumed ideological approaches. Different provincial populations might want to see different policies played out that are more tailored to their specific situations. In some cases, that might be a universal daycare policy, which I personally think is ill-advised based on Quebec's experience. But in other cases, it might be an income-tested voucher for people who are truly low income and can't afford childcare, whatever it might be. This plan doesn't seem to allow for any of that kind of provincial jurisdictional flexibility in creating their own childcare policies. And of course, it also forces the provinces to pony up the cash when they're going to be very in debt, on top of the federal debt reaching $1.2 trillion this year. And then, of course, the already $27 billion a year that we spend on these direct cash payments to parents. So there's a lot of costs at the federal level, and then to then put that on provinces, I think is a little bit unfair and doesn't allow for that provincial decision making that really should be in place.
And Paige, you mentioned the Quebec experience, and indeed the federal government cites the Quebec model approvingly several times in the budget. They're really holding it up as the sort of gold standard here. But you've expressed some skepticism about it. So I don't know if maybe you want to share what you think the challenges are, the problems are with the Quebec model.
Well, the Quebec model is flawed in a lot of ways. It has revealed the flaws of a universal daycare plan. So in addition to just offering an inflexible option to parents where they don't get to necessarily choose an affordable option that they would like a day home, for example. We saw a lot of those independent daycare providers close down in Quebec because the licensed more institutional daycare centers became the subsidized option, and the day homes had a harder time competing. So it did, reduce choice in that way for parents, but it also had a just absolutely ballooning cost. So it was first introduced as $5 a day, then it increased to $7 a day, and then it increased beyond that. That was the parent cost that went up and up. The total cost of the program in 1997 was $300 million and that was like the annual cost, to over $2.7 billion this year. So that's a six-fold increase after inflation. That was a point that was made recently by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And so that's an astronomical increase. And of course, one that, we look at this program now at the federal level and think it looks unaffordable as it is, given our massive debt and the troubling financial position that a lot of provinces are in. And then you look at the ballooning costs. Part of that was that a lot of the daycare workers unionized, which added to the contributing cost. But probably the biggest problem that I have with the Quebec system is that it ended up actually creating more demand for these regulated childcare spaces. And what ended up happening was that wealthier families ended up nabbing the spots. So we actually saw wait lists increase in Quebec as a result, because the wealthier families were nabbing these spots first, which left lower income families lower down on the bottom of the waiting list. Of course, wealthier families could have afforded childcare beforehand. They didn't need any help from the government in order to do so. So it actually created these long waiting lists. Parents also reported that daycare quality went down. There was a lot of downsides when it came to the Quebec program, but the fact that it ended up prioritizing higher income Quebec families and making it harder for lower income Quebec families to attain childcare spots, and of course the astronomical cost that unethically is then passed down to Quebec children who will have to pay for it later, there was a lot of issues.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very progressive. Jack, your thoughts on Quebec?
Well, I think a couple of points. I mean, because the program is universal and applying to everybody, then obviously there are a lot of wealthy and middle-class people that have been able to take advantage of the program. And from what I understand, actually, that the lower income groups have had less access, and for the reasons that Paige gave, which sort of suggests, first of all, really what's the goal of the program? If we're really trying to get after affordability, frankly, the support should have been targeted and to the lower income groups, and that would have saved a lot of money. Also, we shouldn't necessarily presume that just because someone is using daycare facilities that they may actually intending to go out to work. I actually know that there are a lot of people in the wealthier end families that hire their au pairs or might use other types of support for childcare, but the parent is still not working, maybe doing voluntary work and doing other things that are valuable, but still it's a very different thing. And if you're subsidizing just one type of daycare, which is regulated space daycare, then that can naturally push demand up for that specific type of facility without necessarily leading to more employment effects that that have been often discussed with respect to Quebec's program. And then finally, on the employment effects, that has been somewhat exaggerated too. I've actually looked at the numbers. We have to remember that there was increased participation by women in the workforce since the 1990s throughout all the provinces. So some of that increase that occurred in Quebec was just due to changes in preferences of people wanting to work. There were also other changes that occurred in unemployment insurance and other programs that would have also had an impact on the employment rate. And it is true that employment did go up in Quebec for women, which is now higher than it is in other provinces compared to what it was at the start of daycare. But we have to ask the question, is a new program going to push up, or how much is it going to push up employment rates in the rest of the country when already that employment rate for women are 80% or more in many provinces? So that means that we're not actually going to get the big bang. And a lot of the studies that I've seen on, arguing that the Quebec program paid for itself, they're really based on very exaggerated GDP multipliers. The best work I found was Pierre Fortin's work. I think is very cleverly done, and I think uses some very nice techniques. However, when you actually go through the numbers, $1 of daycare spending leads to a $5 increase in GDP. That's a multiplier of 5. And that's the reason why the numbers look so big, and that's why people say it pays for itself. And I always kind of chuckle because, we hear people say that if you cut taxes, you get more taxes. That's the Laffer argument. But when it comes to a lot of these social programs, whether it's daycare or it's guaranteed income, you have a lot of analysis that's doing the same thing as Arthur Laffer did on taxes, that if you spend money, you get more money back, which is just, I think, just is grossly exaggerated in terms of its economic effects. And in fact, the document, the budget document, said that this program, the new program that the federal government is going to have, is the best thing since NAFTA in terms of giving new economic opportunity to Canadians. And anyway, I kind of chuckled when I read that because I couldn't believe that someone would actually put that in script.
Thanks, Jack. It's interesting, Jack. You talk about the economic payoff, and it's interesting that the government has framed this support not just in terms of the help for families, people need the help desperately right now, but that there is supposed to be this huge payoff. And I think you've highlighted some of the problems with the numbers they're putting forward. I guess we should maybe talk a little bit too about what alternatives should be on the table then. This is not the only option. I think most people would agree that it's expensive to raise children in this country. I have 3 kids myself, and I can tell you I've probably spent close to 6 figures in terms of putting them through daycare. But if not this, then what? What are some of the alternative ways that the federal government could get involved to help parents with children? Paige?
Well, when you're talking about affordability, of course, there's always the option to just leave more of people's money in their pockets in the first place by making efforts to reduce government expenditure, lower taxes so parents can actually keep more of their own money, which would solve some of the affordability problem because, a lot of the parents' income gets taken up by taxes and so many other things that we do. But in terms of actual childcare policy, something that's much more flexible, as I mentioned off the top, I think is actually the way to support families and support women, particularly in, the modern context, because we don't have a universal one-size-fits-all type of child, and we don't have a universal one-size-fits-all type of woman or worker. This kind of institutional daycare policy might be great for somebody who drives to work, can drop their kids off on the way, works 9 to 5, but it only fits some people, right? It doesn't fit shift workers. It doesn't fit part-timers. It doesn't fit people who are freelancers who have changing schedules. It doesn't fit people who, require longer work hours from time to time because they travel. They might need overnight care sometimes. So it doesn't fit really modern families. We are seeing a lot more work from home, a lot more just flexibility. I mean, I think that, younger people really desire flexibility in their work days, and we are seeing a lot of that, in addition to essential workers and others who work shifts and might not work well with this type of a policy. And then, of course, this kind of universal daycare policy ignores the fundamental fact that not every child is going to thrive comfortably in an institutional daycare setting. So I think the best type of policy to empower parents and children is to probably some kind of a voucher that would put the money directly into parents' hands so they can make the choice for themselves what kind of childcare they want. Whether that is getting a family member or a neighbor to babysit during the day, sometimes overnight, whenever is needed, whether that's a local day home or an institutional daycare setting, whatever that might be, allowing the family to make that decision. And of course, we already have the Canada Child Benefit. Through that mechanism, the government could put more money into Canadian families' pockets if they wanted to do it that way, so that they could make their own childcare choices. I think that would be, in my view, the best way to actually support modern families and women to make the type of choices that they want, whether that's working full-time, part-time, not at all, whatever it might look like.
Jack, any thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, actually, I agree with Paige that ultimately, if the issue is affordability, then I think then the focus on lower income families, I think, is appropriate. And allowing for choice, I think, is important. There's all sorts of reasons why people have different types of lives and working lives, and need different types of support for childcare. And some further distinctions I would make that Paige didn't mention was, for example, the rural life versus urban life. People who work on farms, they actually they might need seasonal support for childcare as opposed to support all year round. And then, as we mentioned already, there's changes in the workplace where there may be more flexible working arrangements down the road. And that means that the kind of demand for childcare could also change, or the type of childcare that's going to be desired. And so actually, just increasing child benefit actually might have been actually one way of doing it. But if one really wanted to have something tied, you need a very flexible approach in terms of what kind of childcare would qualify. Now, I know that some people argue that it should be regulated childcare that only qualifies is based on child learning opportunities and that sort of thing. And there's a question there that actually what you mean by learning opportunities, because even a child being able to stay at home, as Michael Baker and Kevin Milligan showed, can actually have some very positive impacts on the child's upbringing. So I don't think we should necessarily discount that when thinking about that. And then finally, I also think that the ability of parents to kind of make choices between childcare expenditures and other things that they want is important. And if they do want more, see more learning, the approach of the government might be really expanding junior kindergarten, which is what has been done in some provinces as a very effective way for early childhood learning. And I'm not sure one really wants to do it through just some sort of regulated childcare spaces that are not necessarily really tied to learning anyway.
I'll just mention as well, because Jack just made me think of something, which is just the very important distinction that we don't often see in government policy, which is the difference between schooling and education, right? There are so many ways for children to get education, including at home, as you mentioned, Jack, and in so many different ways. And schooling is different than that. So a lot of these kind of universal daycare arguments talk a lot about extending basically education, like schooling, to, let's say, age 2 in the form of early childhood education, because it produces positive outcomes. There are so many ways for young children to be educated, and that doesn't necessitate being in an institutional school setting. So I think that we really need to view it in that context. I think that's a very important part of this discussion, especially if we're talking about it in the context of early childhood education. And just in terms of, Jack brought up regulated spaces as well. There was some writing, Cardis has done some writing on this as well, another Canadian think tank. And they cited recently some Statistics Canada data showing that before 2020, so I think this was in 2019, only 3% of parents cited the shortage of spaces as the reason for not using childcare. So these statistics, when they're raised by advocates of these universal government daycare programs, are only accounting for licensed daycare spaces. So they're not accounting for the unlicensed day homes that many people favor, for their children, or bringing in a family member or a nanny or a neighbor or whatever it might be to babysit their children. So, when I think that's important too, because do we actually have a shortage of supply of childcare spaces, or do we just need to make it more affordable for people who truly cannot afford childcare? I think, we need to be clear about what the policy goal actually is.
So Paige, just to follow up on that, so you're saying that when people talk about childcare space shortages, they're defining spaces in a very limited way, which allows advocates for national daycare to claim that there's a severe shortage because by definition, they have limited what counts as a space to something of their own liking.
Right. And so, and then there are other policy solutions that you might want to look at. So if the case is that we need more regulated licensed daycare spots, then maybe we need to look at the regulation and look at the cost barriers, for example, of unlicensed childcare spaces like day homes with 4 kids. What's the cost barrier for them to go to be a licensed childcare facility with 5 kids? Is there a way that we can make this less prohibitive? I'm personally not convinced that, this is really the big problem, that we need more regulated childcare spaces. But if that is the issue, then maybe we should be looking, what is stopping childcare providers that are already providing childcare that people use and love from being considered a licensed childcare space, and how can the regulation be maybe changed in that way to make it less prohibitive? But we also saw, as we mentioned in Quebec, that there were a lot of these independent providers that ended up closing as a result of the universal daycare program. So people have to think about, that as a repercussion of a universal daycare policy as well.
Okay. Jack, any more thoughts on that?
No, not particularly. I think Paige really covered the gamut pretty well. I just want to re-emphasize the point Paige mentioned and I mentioned earlier on, that really the question are the goals of what we're trying to achieve. And there is this view that people are mixing early childhood education with affordability issues for daycare. And, there's an old mathematical theorem that when you have 2 objectives, you need 2 different types of policies. And I think the affordability issue should be addressed through support for low-income families that especially need to have both parents working. And so then support should be given in that way. That's the affordability issue. And that obviously is not a universal program that's being proposed in the budget. If it's early childhood education, then that's a totally different sort of thing that we may want to do. And that could be done through all sorts of different mechanisms, whether it's a formal education system or it's through other things. And we should be looking at policies for that, which is a separate kind of question to be looking at. And I should mention that Pierre Fortin put out a paper even last year saying that one of the big failures of the Quebec program has been actually that it's done a very poor job on early childhood education.
Okay.
The other thing that I'll mention as well is just about the affordability issue is that there is some irony in the government's policy here in that the Liberal government changed the universal childcare benefit that the Conservatives had in place, which was universal going to all families, and made it income tested because they said this is better policy. It'll get more targeted in the hands of people who actually need it, lower income, middle class Canadians. And they also in this budget, have proposed taxes on wealthy, other things for wealthier people, whether it's a second home or a luxury vehicle or a boat or whatever it might be. But then a universal daycare policy turns around and subsidizes the daycare of wealthy people who really don't need that subsidization. So it doesn't it's hard to follow the logic. And, given the results that we've seen with the Quebec program, where it did end up putting wealthier people at the top of the waiting list, and to snatch up those spots, it's hard to follow the policy logic, I think, from the government on this one.
Yeah, so they've taken their direct transfers and means tested them for the very reason that they wanted to target the help, and yet now they've developed a policy which does the opposite, which is providing help to people who don't need it. So they're working at cross purposes. Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time to join us today. We at the MLI like to talk about the topical stuff, and we are very pleased to have such eminent folks join us for it. So thank you very much for joining us, both of you, and thank you very much to the audience for joining us today.
Thanks, Aaron.